The document on the table was supposed to appear only after I was dead. I stood in front of the magical council and stared at it anyway. My name was on the header. My case number was on the corner. My death was not, technically, on the page. Not yet. That detail was the only thing keeping my hands still. I knew this room. Not from memory of my own life, because this was not my own life. I had woken up 3 weeks earlier inside the body of a woman named Tessa Mercer. She was a minor character in a story someone else had written. She was supposed to die at the end of chapter 2. I knew the plot the way you know a route you have walked once in the dark. I knew what was coming. I had simply decided not to walk it the way it was written. Martin Keynes sat at the head of the table, senior legal counsel to the council. He was a man built entirely out of quiet reasonableness. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke the language of procedure and safety. Those were words nobody in that room was willing to argue with. He explained, calmly, that Tessa Mercer represented a risk to the council's operations. Before he said the ugly part, he pressed his thumbnail twice against the silver clasp of his watch. Click, click. A small sound. A private habit, the kind you only notice if you are already watching someone for weapons. Then he said it, almost gently, to the man beside him rather than to me. She'll be gone soon enough. Nobody in the room reacted. That was the worst part. It landed like weather. I looked down at the paper in front of me. The meeting date was printed at the top in neat official type. Underneath it, in a different hand, someone had already written the date my license would be revoked. Not a projection. A fact filed in advance, waiting for the rest of us to catch up to it. I ran my thumb along the inside seam of my sleeve. I didn't decide to do it. My hand simply found the stitching and pressed, the way you'd press a bruise to check it's still there. It wasn't my habit. It belonged to the woman whose body I was standing in. I let it happen anyway. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing yet to defend against. I only listened, and I counted the seconds between Martin's sentences. A woman who counts seconds is a woman who is still deciding what to do, not a woman who is already lost. The chamber smelled faintly of old paper and warmed brass fittings. Every council room seemed to smell the same, as if the building itself had been built out of caution. Somewhere behind me a clerk shuffled a stack of forms. The sound was louder than anything Martin had said, because at least the forms didn't pretend to be kind. An older counselor near the end of the table asked whether the matter could wait for a fuller review. She wanted to know if any formal steps really had to happen yet. Martin answered her without pausing, the way a man answers a question he is already prepared for. He said delay only extended the risk to the institution. The council, he said, owed itself the courtesy of moving quickly on matters this clear. Nobody at the table asked what, exactly, was so clear about it. That was the trick of him. He never gave anyone a specific claim solid enough to argue with. He gave them tone and certainty, and the sense that disagreeing with him would be its own kind of embarrassment. I studied the grain of the table in front of me instead of his face. His face gave nothing away. I had already decided that whatever I learned in that room, I would learn from the paper, not from him. By the time I got back to the archive wing, my desk had been given to someone else. Della Brooks was the one who brought me the box. She worked 2 rows down from where my desk used to be, in records. It was the kind of job that makes a person good at noticing when numbers don't match. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She set the box down on the counter between us and let it speak for itself. Inside, on top of a stack of files I no longer had authority to touch, there was a small brass library token. It was worn smooth on one side. I recognized it immediately, and the recognition had nothing to do with me. In the story this woman had been written into, she carried that token until the day she died. I turned it over once in my palm. It was cold, and it didn't belong to me. For a moment, that felt like the truest thing anyone had told me all day. The box itself still had the old workstation number taped to one corner. Someone had covered it with a fresh white label, but not carefully enough. The old number showed through at the edge, a ghost underneath the correction. Della watched me look at it. She didn't say anything comforting. She uncapped the pen in her hand. She set the cap down parallel to the folder in front of her, perfectly straight, like it mattered. Then she went back to her filing. The woman who now sat at my old desk was someone I recognized only vaguely. She was a junior clerk from records who had never once spoken to me. She didn't look up when I passed. Someone had already told her enough of the story to make eye contact unnecessary. Standing there with the box under my arm, I decided something. This would be the last time I let a box speak for me instead of the other way around. The second council session came 9 days later, and this one was worse, because this one had an audience. Martin stood and announced that a rare enchanted artifact had gone missing from council storage. The financial trail, he said, led back to me. He said it the way he said everything, without heat. It was as if he were reading a weather report that happened to be about my life. Owen Fletcher was called to confirm the paperwork. He was young, an auditor, sharp in the way people are sharp before the world has cost them anything. He'd verified the financial document months earlier. He believed, genuinely, that he had done his job correctly. He said so. I watched him rub his thumb along the left arm of his glasses. It was a small nervous tic he probably didn't know he had. I looked at the two versions of the page projected side by side. The ink on the original was a fraction darker than the ink on the copy the council was holding. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice. I noticed and said nothing. A woman who screams about ink color in front of the council looks unstable. Looking unstable was exactly the outcome Martin was hoping to provoke. My sister Nadine sat 3 rows back. She had believed the official story before I ever stood trial for it. I watched her face while Owen spoke. I watched it change slowly, the way ice changes before it cracks. She didn't say anything either. Not yet. Martin pressed his thumbnail against his watch clasp twice, the same small click. Then he moved on to the next item on the agenda. My life was a line item that had just been closed. He thanked Owen for his diligence, in a tone that made diligence sound like a virtue only he was allowed to reward. I asked once whether I could examine the original ledger myself before the session closed. Martin said the request would be logged for a future review, in the same voice he used for everything. The request was never logged at all. I checked 3 days later. There was no record it had ever been made. I walked out of that session having said perhaps 11 words in my own defense. All of them procedural, none of them useful. This was not a fight I could win by being louder than him. I would have to become something quieter than his procedures. I would have to do it where he couldn't see me do it. Late that night, I went back to the archive to find an old copy of my own file. Nothing more ambitious than that. The department had emptied out hours earlier. Someone from the night shift had stepped away from his terminal for a break. The automatic lock on these old systems didn't trigger for 10 minutes of inactivity. Everyone complained about it. Nobody had ever bothered to fix it. The screen in front of me was still open to a financial file. It had my name on it. It had a date of death. It had a compensation amount, a listed recipient, and a status field that read, in tidy green letters, approved. The payment was scheduled for 5 days from that night. I did not cry. I did not sit down. I took out my own phone and photographed the screen twice to be sure the second image was in focus. Then I made myself read the timestamp in the corner. The file had last been modified at 1742 that same day, only hours ago. As casually as you'd update a delivery order. The building around me was empty enough that I could hear the heating pipes ticking somewhere in the walls. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not out of shock. I wanted to memorize the exact shade of green the word approved had been printed in. It was a cheerful color for a status field marking the end of a woman's life. I put my phone away and walked out of the building the same way I had walked in. Unremarkable, unhurried, a woman with nowhere urgent to be. Inside, something had gone very still and very exact. Fear had finished turning into a plan. I knew things the rest of the story didn't know yet. I knew that within the month, the academic wing's containment lab would run into a warding fault. Nobody currently working there had the training to catch it early. I got myself assigned to a minor consulting shift there, quietly, through a request that raised no flags. I solved the fault 2 days before anyone else recognized it as a problem at all. Frank Dalton ran that lab. He was not a warm man, but he was an honest one. Honesty in that building had become rare enough to notice. The first time I walked in, he didn't introduce himself. He handed me a clipboard and asked whether I could read a containment gauge without being told which numbers mattered. I could. He grunted, which I would later learn was the closest thing he had to approval. The fault was in a warding array 2 levels down. It hummed at a frequency just wrong enough that most people walked past it a dozen times without noticing. I noticed on the second pass. The story I remembered had a footnote about this exact lab. A minor character got hurt here, in a scene nobody important was meant to read closely. I wasn't going to let the footnote happen on my watch. I was tired of watching other people's mistakes become other people's excuses to file paperwork about me. I spent 2 evenings rebuilding the containment matrix from the base layer up alone. Asking for help would have meant explaining how I already knew where to look. I wrote the report the way Frank's staff wrote everything in that lab, spare and exact, no adjectives, just numbers and outcomes. He reviewed the last line of my written report twice in total silence before he looked up. Then he offered me a paid position on the spot, funded entirely through the Academy's own budget. The Academy was legally independent from the council. Martin's office had no authority over academic contracts and no reason yet to go looking for one. I signed the paperwork that afternoon. It was the first income in my new life that didn't run through any system he controlled. It felt less like a job and more like a door I had quietly installed in a wall he thought was solid. Della helped me trace the money next. She pulled old disbursement records nobody else wanted to touch. 3 binders worth of ledgers stretched back almost 5 years. Most hadn't been opened since the day they were filed. We worked through them at her kitchen table on 2 consecutive Sundays. Her flat had better light than mine, and she refused to bring the binders anywhere near council property. She read the entries aloud in a flat, patient voice. I marked the ones that repeated, the same modest sum, the same vague label, month after month. They weren't administrative. They ran, eventually, into a private fund Martin controlled personally. It was registered under a name that wasn't his, but traced back to an address that was. Della found the last piece of it near midnight on the second Sunday. Instead of celebrating, she simply sat back. She uncapped her pen and set the cap down parallel to the ledger in front of her, precise as always. Some people build cages out of paperwork, she said, because paperwork is the one thing they think nobody ever really reads. I didn't demand the money back. Not yet. I simply closed the old account it came from and opened a new one, tied to my academic salary. It routed through a private bank with no institutional link to the council's financial system. Nobody flagged the change, because nobody was looking for it. I found a flat in Bristol not long after. It was small, plain, 2 rooms and a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. The windowsill was old wood, soft at the edges from decades of weather. I liked it immediately, for reasons I didn't examine too closely at the time. Buses ran under the window at intervals I learned to sleep through within the first week. The landlord was an older man whose name never mattered to this story. He asked only whether I had steady work and whether I'd be quiet after 10. I said yes to both, and that was the entire truth as far as his paperwork was concerned. I bought my own groceries with my own wages for the first time. I left the receipt on top of the refrigerator for no reason except that I wanted to see it there. Small print, an ordinary total, my name nowhere on it. I stood in the kitchen that first night with the lights off, listening to a bus shift gears below. This particular quiet had never once belonged to Tessa Mercer before. He noticed the absence before he noticed anything specific. I stopped attending the old advisory meetings I used to sit in on. His requests to the Academy started coming back unanswered, or answered by people who had never heard of him. He learned, eventually, secondhand, that I no longer used his department's legal services for anything at all. He didn't understand yet what exactly had shifted. He asked a junior clerk once, offhand, whether anyone had heard from Tessa Mercer lately. The clerk said no and meant it, because there was genuinely nothing left in the council's own systems to hear. Martin didn't ask again after that. Asking twice would have meant admitting the question mattered. Owen was the one who found the crack first, without meaning to. He was handed an old file for a routine recheck, standard procedure, nothing unusual about the assignment itself. He laid the original next to the copy he remembered signing off on months earlier. The dates didn't match. He checked them again. They still didn't match. He understood, slowly and then all at once, what he had done. He'd verified a document that should never have existed in the form he'd seen it in. I didn't ask him to save me. I found him in the archive stacks 2 days later, ostensibly returning a file. I said only, check everything from the first page. That was all. He rubbed his thumb along the arm of his glasses. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding whether I already knew what he'd found. Then he went back to the file. He came to find me himself the following week, in the small courtyard outside the academy. That told me more than anything he could have said. Council staff didn't visit academy grounds without a reason. He didn't sit down. He told me, in the same careful, methodical tone he used for every audit, that he'd cross-checked 11 documents from my case. All against their original submission logs. 4 of them had been altered after the fact. All 4 by the same authorization credential. He didn't say whose. He didn't have to. I thanked him, and he looked briefly like a man who wished he could take the thanks back. Not because he regretted what he'd found. Because he finally understood what it had cost the version of himself who'd signed the original form without looking closely enough. Before he left, he asked me one thing of his own. It was the only personal question he'd put to me since the matter began. He wanted to know how I'd known where to send him looking. I told him only that some documents are wrong in ways you can feel before you can prove. He nodded slowly, like a man filing that answer away for later use. An independent audit accepted my case not long after that. It leaned largely on the inconsistencies Owen had quietly started documenting on his own time. It also leaned on the disbursement records Della had already organized into a binder of her own. Martin had never bothered to cultivate the audit board. In his experience, nobody outside the council's own walls had the standing to move against him. My license was reinstated on a provisional basis. The letter arrived on official council paper, dense with the same procedural language Martin liked to hide behind. This time the procedure was working for me instead of against me. It listed a case number and a reviewing officer's signature. Near the bottom, a single line noted that further inquiry into related financial records was recommended. That line, more than anything else in the letter, told me the ground under him had already begun to move. Martin did not know yet. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table in Bristol, under the soft old windowsill. Then I folded it into a plain folder and went back to work. I didn't celebrate. Celebration felt like something you did when a thing was finished. This wasn't finished. It was only true. Frank found out before Martin did, because the Academy's administration was copied on the reinstatement notice as a matter of course. He said nothing about it in the lab. He only left a printed copy on my desk the next morning, no note attached. From Frank, that was practically a toast. The final session was held in the council's main chamber in Westminster, the largest room in the building. It had a long central table and a screen mounted above it. Nobody had ever needed it for more than routine votes. I arrived early, deliberately, and took a seat near the middle of the table. Accused parties usually sat at the far end. Nobody asked me to move. That alone told me something had already shifted before the session even opened. Martin was there. So was I. So were Della, Owen, Nadine, and Frank, all 5 of us seated at different points around the same table. None of us sat next to each other. None of us needed to. Martin arrived last, the way he always did. He was a man who liked rooms waiting for him, rather than the other way around. He nodded to a few counselors on his way to his chair. Nobody nodded back with quite the same warmth they used to. The chair opened the session by noting that new material had been submitted for review. It came ahead of a final determination in my case. Martin didn't flinch. He said, evenly, that he welcomed any additional clarity. It was the same sentence he had used a dozen times before to close down exactly this kind of inquiry. Owen opened the archive file on the central screen. He had service-level access to the record servers, standard for auditors reviewing verified cases. The system also kept automatic version histories going back years. Nobody had bothered to disable that feature because nobody expected an auditor to use it against the people who ran the place. The first document loaded slowly, the way old council systems always did. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the projector fan and someone's chair creaking. Martin sat very still, waiting for the screen to finish loading. The originals came up on the screen in order. A financial payment tied to my death, created and dated before the accusation against me had even been formally filed. My signature, used on documents whose dates had been quietly changed after filing. And beneath all of it sat Martin's own personal authorization. It was on the legal procedure meant to end, cleanly and quietly, with my death. One of the older counselors leaned forward and asked Owen to confirm the timestamp on the first document again. Out loud, for the record. Owen read it twice, once quickly and once slowly, so nobody in the room could later claim they had misheard him. The date sat there on the screen for a long moment. 3 weeks before my name had ever been formally raised in that chamber. I said nothing. I had promised myself, walking in that morning, that I would let the documents do the work this time. They were doing it considerably better than I ever could have. Della uncapped her pen, set it down parallel to the table's edge, and looked directly at Martin. "This isn't a filing error," she said. Owen rubbed his thumb along his glasses one more time. Then he read the old note aloud from the screen, the one none of us had needed reminding of. "She'll be gone soon enough." Everyone in the room heard it differently this time. It wasn't a prediction anymore. It was evidence of intent, sitting there in his own handwriting, time-stamped months before anyone had accused me of anything at all. Nadine folded the corner of the hearing notice between 2 fingers. It was the small gesture she always made before saying something that cost her something to say. She looked at me across the table. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. She had spent months believing the wrong version of her own sister. "I should have asked you then," she said. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't need her to. It was the only apology either of us was ever going to need spoken aloud in front of that many witnesses. Frank reviewed the last line of the document on the screen twice, the way he reviewed everything. He was unhurried, even in a room full of people holding their breath. Then he addressed the head of the council directly, without waiting to be asked for his opinion. "Her case should be closed today," he said. "There's nothing left here worth debating." A murmur went around the table, the closest thing to open agreement I had heard from any of them in months. Martin pressed his thumbnail against his watch clasp twice, but the click didn't land the way it used to. It sounded, for the first time, exactly like what it was, a nervous man fidgeting. He tried, briefly, to shift the blame onto a subordinate, some junior clerk he claimed must have mishandled the filing. Owen opened the next file before he could finish the sentence. It was Martin's own personal sign-off, dated, initialed, unambiguous. It sat on the screen for every counselor in the room to read for themselves. Nobody in that room needed me to explain anything anymore. I sat and watched people who had once believed him discover, in his own handwriting, exactly what he was. By the end of that week, Martin had been removed from his post pending review. The independent inquiry into his private fund ran on for months after that. For the first time in his career, he had no say in how it would end. 3 days later, he found me outside the academy gates, waiting, as if the last several months hadn't happened. He looked smaller out there than he ever had at the head of a table. Without the room built around him, his calm didn't sound like authority anymore. He offered me a deal, the only language he'd ever really spoken. He would withdraw the accusation, restore my old position, compensate me for the losses. In exchange, I would withdraw my testimony and let the whole matter close quietly, the way he preferred everything to close. He listed the terms the way he listed everything, in order, without a single wasted word. Efficiency alone, it seemed, might still save him. His hand drifted toward his watch clasp once, out of habit. Then it stopped halfway, as if even his own hands weren't sure the gesture would still work on me. He still thought in terms of transactions. I let him finish. Then I reached into my coat and took out the brass library token. It was the same one I'd found in a cardboard box on the worst day of this story. It had once belonged to a woman who carried it until she died. I set it down on the low wall between us. He looked at it and didn't understand. "You were right," I told him. "I'll be gone soon enough." For a moment he almost smiled, thinking I'd finally surrendered. "Just not where you can reach me," I said. I left the token where it sat and walked back through the gates without looking behind me. That was the only ending I owed him. A few months on, I work in the Academy's research wing. The brass token sits on the corner of my desk now, beside a contract that belongs entirely to me. So tell me, was her ending fair, or did Martin deserve worse than a quiet gate and an empty hand? Like this video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.